In 711 CE, there was a general named Tariq ibn Ziyad who crossed the Strait of Gibraltar with an army at his back and changed the course of European history in a way that you were never fully taught in school. Within 8 years, the Moors, Muslim Berbers and Arabs from North Africa had taken control of most of the Iberian Peninsula, what is now namely known as Spain and Portugal. At first, they called it Al-Andalus, but what they later built there over the next several centuries was so advanced, so culturally rich, and so consequential for the future of Europe that ignoring it would take a whole misunderstanding of where modern civilization actually came from. So let's talk about it. First of all, who even were the Moors? The word itself has a complicated history. It comes from the Greek mauros, meaning dark or very dark, which passed through Latin and eventually into European languages. This served as a catch-all term for Muslim inhabitants of North Africa and the Iberian Peninsula. In practice, it was used loosely, sometimes referring specifically to Berbers, sometimes to Arabs, sometimes it was directed to anyone of African or Muslim descent. The Moors themselves would not have used this term because they were Berbers, Arabs, and the various peoples of North Africa, united by faith and culture rather than letting a single ethnic identity tear them apart. What united them in Al-Andalus was what they built, and what they happened to build was extraordinary. At a time when much of Europe was fragmented and in a sense underdeveloped, it was largely cut off from the intellectual legacy of the ancient world. Thus included the Moorish cities of Córdoba, Granada, and Toledo, which were operating on a completely different level. Córdoba alone had 471 mosques, 300 public baths, and a library holding around 400,000 volumes. Factor in that this was at a time when most of Europe's monasteries considered a few dozen manuscripts enough for a significant collection. The city had lampposts lighting its streets at night. The properties and houses were air-conditioned in summer through systems that drew fresh air across flower beds chosen for their scent, while staying heated in winter through hot air piped installed in the walls. This was all during the 9th and 10th centuries. To put in perspective, let that sink in for a second. The scholars who gathered in these cities were working across mathematics, astronomy, medicine, philosophy, engineering, and architecture. However, they weren't just preserving ancient knowledge, but they were advancing it. The word algebra comes directly from the Arabic al-Jabr, from a treatise written by the Muslim scholar al-Khwarizmi. The Arabic numeral system was the origin of the numbers you use every day, including the concept of zero and positional value, surprisingly entered Europe through Moorish Spain. Without it, the mathematical and commercial revolutions of the following centuries become nearly impossible to imagine. By the 13th century, European merchants were using this system to calculate interest rates, currency exchange, and double-entry bookkeeping. The economic machinery of the modern world has Arabic numerals at its foundation. The knowledge transfer didn't stop at mathematics. Trigonometry, advanced astronomy, chemistry, agricultural science, and medicine all flowed from Al-Andalus into the rest of Europe through translation, primarily in Toledo, which became one of the great centers of cross-cultural scholarship in the medieval world. Christian and Jewish scholars traveled there specifically to learn. Arabic versions of Greek texts that Europe had lost access to were translated back into Latin. This was along with the original work of Muslim thinkers whose ideas would go on to shape European philosophy for centuries. Ibn Rushd, known in Europe as Averroes, produced commentaries on Aristotle so influential that an entire school of European philosophy, called Averroism, it was named after him. Thomas Aquinas, one of the most important theologians in Christian history, engaged seriously and respectfully with Muslim philosophical tradition, seeing Muslim thinkers as occupying the same intellectual world as himself. With the navigation tools that powered the age of exploration and the astrolabes that allowed European sailors to determine their position at sea, were refined and improved by Moorish scholars. The star charts and planetary models that guided European ships across the Atlantic in the 15th and 16th centuries drew directly on Islamic astronomical work developed centuries earlier in Al-Andalus. When Columbus sailed west in 1492, he was using tools shaped in significant part by the civilization his patrons had just finished driving out of Spain. And then there's the architecture. Moorish design introduced Europe to horseshoe arches with geometric tilework called zellage. This would involve interwoven arches and the Riyadh courtyard. In other words, a central garden with a fountain divided into 4 parts, reflecting the Quranic vision of paradise. These weren't just beautiful, they were technically sophisticated, combining Arab, Roman, Greek, and Byzantine influences into something entirely new. The most famous surviving example is the Alhambra Palace in Granada, which has drawn visitors from across the world for centuries and remains one of the most visited sites in Europe today. When Christian kingdoms began retaking Moorish cities during the Reconquista, namely known as the centuries-long campaign to reclaim Iberia for Christianity, they didn't tear all of this down. They just reused it. Mosques started to become churches with Christian additions. Muslim craftsmen were commissioned to build palaces and public buildings in what became known as the Mudejar style, a fusion of Islamic and European design that flourished well into the 16th century. Aside from that, the Cathedral of Teruel was built in the Romanesque style, with a ceiling painted by Muslim artists and a tower that blends Islamic geometric patterns with Gothic architectural elements. Nonetheless, Europe absorbed Moorish influence even as it was pushing the Moors out. None of this erases the complexity of what the Moorish period actually was. It wasn't a futuristic Elon Musk utopia. The initial conquest of Spain was more of a military campaign, swift, organized, and at times brutal. The tolerance that characterized much of the Moorish period in Andalusia was real, but it was uneven and it shifted over time. Under the early Caliphate of Cordoba, Muslims, Christians, and Jews lived and worked alongside each other with a degree of coexistence that was genuinely unusual for the medieval world. Jewish scholarship flourished, while Christian scholars were free to study and translate. The word historians use for this period is convivencia, creating a fruitful coexistence between them. It would later produce one of the most intellectually creative environments in European history. But as political power shifted and more orthodox rulers took control, that tolerance eroded. The great Jewish philosopher Moses Maimonides was forced to leave Andalusia during a period of stricter rule. Christians were at times treated as second-class subjects. When the Reconquista itself came, this brought its own violence. Muslim civilians were killed, mosques razed, and sadly libraries burned, losing many centuries of knowledge. Toledo fell to Christian armies in 1085, and Granada, the last Moorish stronghold, only surrendered on January 2, 1492. This was the same year Columbus sailed, the same year the Spanish Inquisition was already underway, the same year Jews were expelled from Spain entirely. 1492 was not just a year of European expansion. It was a year of enormous cultural destruction all around. What eventually survived is what started in architecture, in mathematics, in philosophy, in navigation, and in medicine. All of this combined shaped the European Renaissance in ways that are still underacknowledged. The connection between the intellectual flowering of Moorish Spain and the explosion of learning that followed in Europe is not a coincidence. It's a transmission where ideas moved, people moved, because knowledge crossed borders in both directions. The Moorish civilization that eventually produced the scientific revolution and the age of exploration was standing, all built on a foundation built in the libraries and academies of Al-Andalus.